It was a crisp autumn morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport when Mrs. Chen hurried through the terminal, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor. As a high-powered marketing executive who had just wrapped up a frustrating morning of delayed meetings, her patience was already wearing thin. Her perfectly pressed suit and immaculate appearance masked the storm brewing inside her. Running a few minutes later than she'd like, Mrs. Chen made her way to Gate B-23 for her first-class flight to Los Angeles. She had always believed that her success in life entitled her to certain comforts, and flying first class was non-negotiable. As she approached her seat, 3A, she noticed a man in a well-tailored navy suit already settled in 3B, deeply focused on a stack of medical files spread across his tray table. The man looked up and offered a warm smile. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, beginning to gather his papers to make room. She could see his name badge clipped to his jacket pocket, Dr. Anthony Rivera, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery at Cedar Valley Medical Center. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted from mild annoyance to obvious displeasure. Without returning his greeting, she immediately pressed the call button, her manicured finger jabbing it repeatedly until a flight attendant appeared. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" asked the flight attendant, Ms. Patel, maintaining a professional smile despite Mrs. Chen's obvious agitation. "No, everything is not all right," Mrs. Chen said in a stage whisper that was clearly intended to be heard. "I need to change my seat immediately." She glanced pointedly at Dr. Rivera, who had returned to reviewing his medical files, though his slightly tightened jaw suggested he could hear every word. "I just don't feel comfortable with this seating arrangement," Mrs. Chen continued, her tone dripping with implications that made several nearby passengers look up from their pre-flight routines. "Surely you must have another first-class seat available." Ms. Patel's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened slightly. "I apologize, ma'am, but we're operating at full capacity today. All first-class seats are occupied." She gestured to the settling cabin, where indeed, every seat was filling up with passengers. "Well, this is simply unacceptable," Mrs. Chen huffed, her voice rising. "I paid good money for this seat, and I expect certain standards to be maintained." Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, making several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Throughout this exchange, Dr. Rivera remained focused on his medical files, though anyone paying attention might have noticed how his shoulders had tensed slightly. He was reviewing presentation slides for a groundbreaking surgical technique he would be demonstrating at a major medical conference in Los Angeles. Clearly, he was trying to maintain his dignity and professionalism in the face of such blatant prejudice. Mrs. Chen, realizing she wouldn't get her way, slumped into her seat, making a show of moving as far to the edge as possible. She pulled out her phone and began furiously typing, presumably complaining about her situation to someone who might sympathize with her outdated views. The other passengers had witnessed the entire scene, and the atmosphere in first class grew thick with tension. A few people whispered among themselves, casting disapproving glances in Mrs. Chen's direction. One elderly gentleman shook his head sadly, while a young woman 2 rows ahead turned around to give Dr. Rivera an apologetic smile. As the flight attendants began their final preparations for takeoff, no one could have predicted how this uncomfortable situation would soon take a dramatic turn, or how Mrs. Chen's prejudiced behavior would come back to haunt her in the most unexpected way possible. The plane had just reached its cruising altitude when the seatbelt sign dinged off. Mrs. Chen immediately unbuckled her belt and shifted even further away from Dr. Rivera, making her discomfort painfully obvious to everyone around her. She pulled out her laptop and began typing aggressively, as if trying to create a wall between herself and her seat neighbor. Dr. Rivera, meanwhile, continued reviewing his medical files with remarkable composure. His presentation tomorrow would introduce a revolutionary heart surgery technique that could save countless lives. Every now and then, he would make careful notes in the margins, completely focused on his work despite the hostile environment beside him. A kind-looking flight attendant, Ms. Patel, approached their row with the drink cart. "Would either of you care for a beverage?" she asked, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the earlier scene. "I'll have sparkling water, please," Dr. Rivera responded with a gentle smile. Before Ms. Patel could even turn to Mrs. Chen, the marketing executive cut in sharply. I'd prefer if you could serve me first, she said, her voice dripping with entitlement. And make sure you're using a fresh glass, not one that's been. She paused, glancing sideways at Dr. Rivera, contaminated. Several passengers within earshot gasped quietly. Miss Patel's hands trembled slightly as she poured Mrs. Chen's drink, but her voice remained steady. Ma'am, I can assure you that all our glasses are properly sanitized according to airline regulations. A businessman across the aisle cleared his throat loudly and deliberately caught Dr. Rivera's eye. Excuse me, doctor, he said in a carrying voice. I couldn't help but notice your medical files. Are you heading to the International Cardiac Surgery Conference? I read about it in the medical journal my hospital publishes. Dr. Rivera nodded politely. Yes, I'm giving the keynote presentation on a new minimally invasive technique. The businessman's eyes widened with genuine interest. Oh, you're that Dr. Rivera? Your research on pediatric heart surgeries is incredible. My colleague was just telling me about how your methods have reduced recovery time by almost 40%. Mrs. Chen's typing slowed slightly, though she pretended not to listen. Other passengers began to take notice of the conversation, several turning in their seats with interest. A young nurse sitting 2 rows ahead turned around excitedly. Dr. Rivera, I've read all your published papers. Your work has revolutionized how we approach post-operative care in the cardiac unit. I can't believe I'm on the same flight as you. As more passengers joined the conversation, discussing Dr. Rivera's achievements and contributions to medical science, Mrs. Chen sank lower in her seat. Her earlier behavior was now cast in an even worse light as the full scope of Dr. Rivera's expertise and reputation became clear to everyone in the cabin. Ms. Patel returned with fresh drinks and a warm smile directed at Dr. Rivera. Doctor, we're honored to have you on board today. My cousin's daughter had heart surgery last year using your technique. She recovered so quickly, it was amazing. The atmosphere in first class had shifted dramatically. What started as a tense, uncomfortable situation had transformed into an impromptu celebration of medical innovation and human achievement. Everyone, it seemed, had a story about how advanced cardiac care had touched their lives or the lives of their loved ones. Everyone except Mrs. Chen, who now sat in mortified silence, her laptop forgotten in her lap. Her earlier prejudiced behavior hung heavy in the air around her, made all the more shameful by the revelation of who she had tried to reject as a seatmate. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of her humbling journey, and fate had an even more powerful lesson in store for her. Just as the flight settled into its smooth cruise over the Midwest, a commotion erupted 3 rows ahead. An elderly gentleman suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorted in pain. His breathing became labored, and he slumped forward in his seat. "Help! Is something wrong with my husband?" called out a frightened elderly woman sitting next to him. Her trembling hands reached for him as he struggled to breathe. Ms. Patel rushed to their row. "Sir, can you hear me? Are you all right?" The elderly man could only respond with a grimace of pain, his face growing pale and sweaty. "We need a doctor. Is there a medical professional on board?" Ms. Patel's voice carried through the cabin with urgent professionalism. Dr. Rivera immediately stood up, gathering his expertise along with his composure, but as he tried to step into the aisle, Mrs. Chen's arm shot out, blocking his path. "Wait," she said loudly, her voice tinged with lingering prejudice despite everything she just learned. "Shouldn't we wait for a different kind of doctor?" The passengers around them stared in disbelief. The businessman across the aisle stood up angrily. "Ma'am, that man is literally one of the top heart surgeons in the country, and someone needs help." Dr. Rivera remained professional, gently but firmly moving past Mrs. Chen's attempt to block him. "Sir," he called ahead to the elderly man, already moving forward, "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. Please, let me help you." The elderly man's wife looked up with desperate hope in her eyes. "Please, help my Robert. We were flying to Los Angeles for our grandson's graduation." Dr. Rivera reached them quickly, his practiced hands already checking the man's pulse. "Sir, can you describe the pain? Is it sharp or dull? Does it radiate to your arm?" Through gasping breaths, the elderly man managed to communicate that the pain was like a heavy pressure spreading across his chest and down his left arm, classic heart attack symptoms. "Ms. Patel, I need the plane's emergency medical kit immediately." Dr. Rivera commanded calmly. "And please ask if anyone has aspirin." The whole cabin sprang into action. Miss Patel rushed to get the medical kit. A young woman offered up aspirin from her purse. The nurse who had praised Dr. Rivera's work earlier came forward to assist. Mrs. Chen watched all this unfold, her face a mix of shame and concern. But something else was happening too, a growing look of recognition as she stared at the elderly man being treated. The color drained from her face as realization dawned. "Uncle Robert," she whispered, though no one heard her over the focused medical response taking place. Dr. Rivera worked with practiced efficiency, his movements sure and precise. He administered the aspirin, checked vital signs, and began emergency protocols that might save the man's life. All thoughts of the earlier confrontation were set aside in favor of what really mattered, helping someone in need. The elderly man's breathing began to ease slightly under Dr. Rivera's care, though he clearly wasn't out of danger. "We need to land this plane," Dr. Rivera announced to Ms. Patel. "He needs proper hospital care as soon as possible." As the flight attendants began coordinating with the pilots for an emergency landing, Mrs. Chen sat frozen in her seat. She watched as the doctor she had discriminated against worked tirelessly to save her own uncle's life, a man she hadn't even recognized when she first boarded, not having seen him in several years. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the other passengers, many of whom had now pieced together the connection based on Mrs. Chen's shocked expression and distressed murmuring. The universe, it seemed, had orchestrated the perfect lesson in humility and the foolishness of prejudice. As the pilot announced they would be making an emergency landing in Denver, Mrs. Chen buried her face in her hands, the full weight of her earlier behavior crashing down on her. She had no way of knowing that this moment would mark the beginning of a profound change in her life. The plane began its emergency descent into Denver International Airport. Every bump of turbulence made Mrs. Chen's heart jump as she watched Dr. Rivera continue treating her uncle. The doctor had loosened Uncle Robert's tie and collar, keeping a constant eye on his vital signs, while speaking softly to keep him calm. "The pain level, sir, is it getting any better with the medication?" Dr. Rivera asked, his hand steady on Uncle Robert's wrist, monitoring his pulse. Aunt Rose, Uncle Robert's wife, clutched her husband's other hand, tears sliding down her cheeks. "A little," Uncle Robert managed to say between careful breaths. "Thank you, doctor." Mrs. Chen couldn't stay in her seat any longer. She unbuckled her seatbelt and moved forward, her legs shaking. "Uncle Robert," she said quietly, her voice cracking. "It's me." Aunt Rose looked up, her eyes widening with recognition and then narrowing slightly. "Oh, you're here too? What, eh?" Surprise. The coolness in her aunt's voice suggested she might have witnessed Mrs. Chen's earlier behavior toward Dr. Rivera. Dr. Rivera glanced briefly at Mrs. Chen, but remained focused on his patient. "His pulse is stabilizing, but we need to get him to a hospital as soon as possible. Ms. Patel, how long until we land?" 10 minutes, doctor, the flight attendant responded, returning with more supplies. "Emergency medical services are standing by at the airport." The businessman who had recognized Dr. Rivera earlier spoke up from his seat. "I have a contact at Denver Memorial Hospital. They have an excellent cardiac unit. Would you like me to call ahead?" "That would be very helpful, thank you," Dr. Rivera replied, still monitoring Uncle Robert's condition. Mrs. Chen stood awkwardly in the aisle, wanting to help but not knowing how. The gravity of her earlier actions weighed heavily on her as she watched Dr. Rivera work. He was the man she had treated with such disdain, now potentially saving her beloved uncle's life. "I don't understand," Aunt Rose said quietly, looking at her husband's pale face. "We were just coming to surprise you at your birthday party next week." Robert insisted on flying out early to help with the preparations. Mrs. Chen felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her uncle, always thinking of others, had wanted to surprise her. And how had she repaid this family love? By showing the worst side of herself to someone who was now proving to be their guardian angel. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and Dr. Rivera steadied Uncle Robert with a gentle hand. "We're almost there, sir. You're doing great. Keep taking slow, deep breaths for me." "The EMTs are ready and waiting at Gate 4, Ms. Patel announced, returning from the cockpit. "They'll come aboard as soon as we land." Mrs. Chen watched as Dr. Rivera quickly wrote down vital signs and symptoms on a napkin. "This will help the emergency team," he explained to Aunt Rose. "Every piece of information can be crucial for treatment." The plane began its final descent, and Mrs. Chen had to return to her seat. As she buckled in, she couldn't help but notice how every action Dr. Rivera took was measured and professional, despite her earlier treatment of him. The contrast between his character and her behavior became sharper with each passing moment. "Please let him be okay," she whispered to herself, watching her uncle from afar. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man she had tried to avoid sitting next was now the one person she was desperately grateful to have on this flight. As the plane touched down in Denver, the full impact of the situation hit her. This wasn't just about her uncle's health, it was about her own sick prejudices being laid bare in the most personal way possible. And somehow, she knew this was just the beginning of a very important lesson. The scene at Denver International Airport was a blur of activity as emergency medical personnel boarded the plane. Dr. Rivera efficiently briefed the EMTs about Uncle Robert's condition, speaking in calm, professional terms while never leaving his patient's side. BP was initially 160/95ths, now stabilized at 140/90ths, Dr. Rivera explained, handing over his detailed notes. Patient responded well to initial treatment, but needs immediate cardiac evaluation. Mrs. Chen stood in the aisle, watching helplessly as they carefully transferred her uncle onto a wheelchair. Aunt Rose gathered their carry-on bags with trembling hands. The other passengers sat quietly, the usual rush to the plane forgotten in light of the emergency. "Doctor," one of the EMTs said, clearly impressed, "your quick action likely prevented this from becoming much worse. Are you based in Denver? We could use someone with your expertise during transport." "I'm just a passenger," Dr. Rivera replied modestly. "But I'll accompany you to the hospital if that would be helpful. I can share my observations during transport." Aunt Rose grabbed Dr. Rivera's hand. "Please come with us. I'd feel so much better knowing you're there." She turned to Mrs. Chen with a pointed look. "Your uncle is lucky that such a qualified doctor was on board, though some people might not have appreciated that blessing." Mrs. Chen felt her face burn with shame. Several passengers who had witnessed her earlier behavior shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The businessman who'd recognized Dr. Rivera shook his head disapprovingly. As they began moving toward the exit, Ms. Patel approached Dr. Rivera. "Doctor, we've arranged for your luggage to be transferred. The airline will rebook your connecting flight at no charge, of course." "Thank you," he said, still focused on monitoring Uncle Robert as they moved down the aisle. Mrs. Chen followed behind, feeling increasingly small with each step. In the terminal, a small crowd had gathered to watch the emergency response. The nurse from the flight had also deplaned to help, and she was explaining to airport staff how Dr. Rivera had handled the situation perfectly. "You should have seen him," the nurse said admiringly to a gate agent. "He knew exactly what to do. Did you know he pioneered a new cardiac surgery technique? He's supposed to be presenting it at a conference tomorrow." Mrs. Chen's heart sank further. Not only had she treated this man terribly, but he was also potentially missing an important professional commitment to help her uncle. The EMTs began moving Uncle Robert toward the ambulance, with Dr. Rivera and Aunt Rose alongside. Mrs. Chen hurried to keep up, but her aunt's cold shoulder made it clear she wasn't particularly welcome. "I'll follow in a taxi," Mrs. Chen called out weakly. "Do what you want," Aunt Rose replied without looking back. "Though I'm surprised you'd want to share a ride with someone you might feel uncomfortable around." The sting of her aunt's words hit hard. Other passengers walking past to their connecting flights cast knowing looks in her direction. The story of her behavior had clearly spread throughout the cabin during the emergency. Standing alone in the terminal, Mrs. Chen watched the ambulance pull away. The red lights flashed silently behind the terminal windows, taking her uncle toward the help he needed, help that came from the very person she had discriminated against. The businessman from the flight approached her as he walked past. "You know," he said quietly, "Dr. Rivera is scheduled to teach his surgical technique to hundreds of doctors tomorrow. That presentation could help save thousands of lives." But he didn't hesitate to risk missing it to help your uncle. He paused, letting his words sink in. Makes you think about what really matters, doesn't it? Mrs. Chen stood frozen, her designer handbag hanging limply at her side. All her superficial judgments and prejudices felt meaningless now. As she finally moved to find a taxi, she realized that this experience wasn't just about her uncle's health, it was about her own need for serious heart surgery of a different kind. The waiting room at Denver Memorial Hospital buzzed with quiet activity as Mrs. Chen sat alone, separated from her aunt who had chosen a seat across the room. The clock on the wall seemed to move impossibly slowly as they waited for news about Uncle Robert's condition. A young resident occasionally passed through, updating families about their loved ones, but had nothing new to report about Uncle Robert. Mrs. Chen watched as Aunt Rose anxiously twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd had for as long as Mrs. Chen could remember. Mrs. Carter. A nurse appeared with a clipboard. "Your husband's initial tests are complete. Dr. Rivera would like to speak with you." Aunt Rose stood up quickly and, after a moment's hesitation, gestured stiffly to Mrs. Chen. "You might as well come too. He's your uncle after all." They followed the nurse down a quiet hallway to a consultation room. Dr. Rivera sat at a small desk, reviewing test results. He looked tired but focused, his earlier presentation files now replaced with Uncle Robert's medical charts. "Please, sit down," he said kindly, showing no trace of resentment toward Mrs. Chen. "I've reviewed the test results with the hospital's cardiac team. Your husband experienced what we call an acute coronary syndrome, essentially a warning sign before a major heart attack. But he'll be okay." Aunt Rose's voice trembled. "Thanks to the quick intervention on the plane, we caught it early," Dr. Rivera explained. "The hospital team is prepping him for a procedure to prevent a full cardiac event. With your permission, I'd like to assist. I actually specialize in the technique they'll be using." Mrs. Chen spoke up for the first time. "But your conference, your presentation?" Dr. Rivera turned to her with a gentle but firm expression. "Some things are more important than presentations, Mrs. Chen. Your uncle needs the best care possible, and I can help provide that." Aunt Rose reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, doctor, for everything. On the plane, and now, we're so blessed to have you here." She shot a meaningful look at her niece. Mrs. Chen felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't deserve your kindness, Dr. Rivera. After how I treated you." "Mrs. Chen," he interrupted softly, "right now, this isn't about you or me. This is about your uncle's health. That's all that matters." A knock at the door interrupted them as another doctor entered. "Dr. Rivera? The ore is ready whenever you are." "Thank you," he replied, standing up. "Mrs. Carter, we'll take excellent care of your husband. The procedure should take about 2 hours." As he turned to leave, Mrs. Chen found her voice again. "Dr. Rivera?" He paused at the door. I'm sorry. I was wrong. So terribly wrong." He nodded quietly, acknowledging her words without diminishing their importance. "Sometimes life gives us unexpected lessons, Mrs. Chen. The real test is what we choose to do with them." With that, he left to prepare for the surgery. Back in the waiting room, Mrs. Chen noticed a local newspaper left on a chair. The front page of the lifestyle section featured an article about the cardiac surgery conference, with Dr. Rivera's photo and a headline about his revolutionary techniques. The article mentioned how his methods had already saved hundreds of lives, particularly in underserved communities. Aunt Rose saw what she was reading. "He's quite remarkable, isn't he? Not just his medical skills, but his humanity. Despite how some people might treat him." Her words carried the weight of the morning's events. Mrs. Chen carefully folded the newspaper, her uncle's life now in the hands of the very man she had judged so harshly. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. While she had been concerned about sitting next to him on a plane, he was now literally holding her uncle's heart in his hands. Hours crawled by in the hospital waiting room. Mrs. Chen had gotten up several times to get coffee from the vending machine, more for something to do than any desire to drink it. The paper cup in her hands had gone cold, untouched, as she lost herself in thoughts about the morning's events. A young family sat nearby, their little boy playing quietly with toys from the hospital's donation box. He looked up occasionally at Mrs. Chen, offering innocent smiles that made her heart ache. She thought about how children were born free of prejudice, how they had to learn such ugly things from adults like her. Would you like a fresh coffee? It was the nurse from the airplane who had apparently stayed to help during her layover. She held out a steaming cup from the staff break room. Thank you, Mrs. Chen said softly, accepting the coffee. You didn't have to stay at the hospital. The nurse shrugged. I had a connecting flight anyway. Besides, I wanted to see how your uncle does. Dr. Rivera's work is amazing to witness. She paused, then added gently, you know, I almost didn't become a nurse because some people made assumptions about me based on how I look. But then I realized that proving them wrong was less important than helping people who needed it. Mrs. Chen felt fresh shame wash over her. How do you move past experiences like that? By remembering that change is always possible, the nurse replied. Every day is a chance to be better than we were yesterday. Across the room, Aunt Rose was talking quietly with another waiting family, sharing stories about Uncle Robert. He insisted on flying out early for her birthday. Mrs. Chen heard her aunt saying, "That's just the kind of person he is, always thinking of others." The words hit Mrs. Chen hard. While her uncle had been planning to surprise her with his early arrival, she had been sitting on that plane, displaying the worst kind of behavior. The contrast between his thoughtfulness and her prejudice was stark. A doctor came through the automatic doors and everyone looked up hopefully, but he headed to another family. Mrs. Chen watched as they received what appeared to be good news, hugging each other with relief. She prayed her family would soon have a similar moment. The little boy from earlier wandered over to Mrs. Chen, holding up a crayon drawing. "This is for your uncle," he said simply. "My grandpa was sick too, but the doctors made him better." Mrs. Chen accepted the drawing, a bright, colorful picture of a smiling sun over a hospital. In the child's innocent artwork, the hospital wasn't a place of worry and fear, but of hope and healing. She carefully folded the paper and tucked it into her purse, making a mental note to share it with Uncle Robert when he recovered. "When I was little," Aunt Rose suddenly spoke, having moved closer, "your uncle used to say that hospitals were like lighthouses. They guide people to safety when they're lost in storms." She sat down next to Mrs. Chen, their first moment of closeness since the flight. "He'd be proud of how Dr. Rivera is helping others, wouldn't he?" Mrs. Chen nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Her aunt's small gesture of reconciliation meant more than she could express. "You know," Aunt Rose continued, her voice thoughtful, "sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most important changes. When we face things about ourselves we don't like to see." "I was so wrong, Aunt Rose," Mrs. Chen whispered. "So terribly wrong." "Yes, you were," her aunt agreed, but her voice was gentle. "But admitting that is the first step to being better." She patted Mrs. Chen's hand. "Now we just have to pray that Robert pulls through this, and then we can all work on healing, in more ways than one." The waiting room clock showed just past 7 p.m. when Dr. Rivera finally emerged from the operating room. His surgical cap was still on, and despite looking tired, he wore a gentle smile that made Mrs. Chen's heart leap with hope. Aunt Rose grabbed her niece's hand instinctively as they both stood up. "The procedure went very well," Dr. Rivera announced, removing his cap. "We were able to clear the blockage and place a stent. Your husband's vital signs are strong, and he's responding perfectly to treatment." Aunt Rose burst into tears of relief, pulling Dr. Rivera into an unexpected hug. Thank you so much," she sobbed. The nurse from the airplane, who had stayed through her entire layover, clapped quietly from her corner of the waiting room. "When can we see him?" Mrs. Chen asked softly, aware that she probably had no right to make such requests after her earlier behavior. "He's in recovery now," Dr. Rivera explained, showing no sign of holding a grudge. "Once he's settled in his room, you can visit briefly. He's still groggy from the anesthesia, but he's already asked about both of you." The little boy who had given Mrs. Chen the drawing tugged at Dr. Rivera's scrubs. "Did you fix him like they fixed my grandpa?" Dr. Rivera knelt down to the child's level, his face brightening. "Yes, we did. And you know what? Your drawing helped. Good wishes and kind thoughts always make people feel better." Mrs. Chen watched this interaction with fresh eyes. Here was the man she had refused to sit next to, showing such gentle kindness to a child after performing life-saving surgery on her uncle. The contrast between his character and her earlier prejudice felt like a physical ache in her chest. "Dr. Rivera," she began, her voice trembling, about this morning on the plane. He held up a hand gently. Mrs. Chen, please. Your uncle is doing well. That's what matters right now. Though if you really want to make things right, there are better ways than apologizing to me. What do you mean? She asked. The cardiac unit here runs a community outreach program, he explained. They'd provide free heart screenings in underserved neighborhoods. They're always looking for volunteers and support. He paused meaningfully. Sometimes the best way to right a wrong is to turn it into something good for others. The nurse who had stayed approached them. Doctor, you've missed your conference. The presentation was supposed to start an hour ago. Some things are more important, he replied simply. Besides, there will be other conferences. A life can't wait. A hospital volunteer appeared to guide them to Uncle Robert's room. As they walked down the quiet hallway, Mrs. Chen noticed a wall covered with thank you cards and photos, grateful patients and their families whose lives had been touched by the hospital staff. Your uncle will need to take things easy for a while, Dr. Rivera explained as they walked. But with proper care and rehabilitation, he should make a full recovery. I've already spoken with his regular physician back home, and they'll coordinate his follow-up care. At the door to Uncle Robert's room, he stopped them briefly. He's still very tired, so just a short visit for now. Try not to overwhelm him. Aunt Rose went in first, while Mrs. Chen lingered in the doorway. Looking at her uncle's peaceful face, knowing how close she'd come to losing him, she felt the full weight of the day's lessons. She turned to thank Dr. Rivera one more time, but he had already moved on to his next patient, his footsteps echoing softly down the hospital corridor. 1 month later, Mrs. Chen stood at the entrance of Denver Memorial Hospital, a very different person from the woman who had first walked these halls. She adjusted her volunteer badge and smoothed down her simple blouse, no designer labels this time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as families began arriving for visiting hours. Inside the cardiac unit's waiting room, she recognized the same chairs where she had sat during those anxious hours. Now, every Saturday, she spent her time here comforting other families going through similar ordeals. It had become her way of making amends, not just to Dr. Rivera, but to herself and the world. "Good morning," called out the nurse from the flight, who had since become a good friend. "Ready for another busy day?" "Always," Mrs. Chen replied with a warm smile. "How's your student program going?" "Wonderful. 5 of our volunteers have already applied to nursing school. When they see doctors like Dr. Rivera working with patients from all walks of life, it really inspires them." Mrs. Chen nodded, remembering how Uncle Robert was doing so well in his recovery back home. His regular video calls always included grateful mentions of Dr. Rivera and the hospital staff. Even more meaningful were the conversations they now had about life, prejudice, and the power of change. A young woman approached the information desk, looking lost and worried. Mrs. Chen recognized that look. She had worn it herself not so long ago. "My father's having tests done," the woman explained anxiously. "I don't know where to go." "I'll help you," Mrs. Chen said gently, stepping forward. "I remember how overwhelming this can feel. Let's find out where your father is, and then I'll show you the best place to wait. We even have fresh coffee." As they walked together, Mrs. Chen noticed Dr. Rivera down the hall, explaining a procedure to a patient's family. He caught her eye and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. They didn't need words anymore. Her actions spoke louder than any apology could. Later that afternoon, during her break, Mrs. Chen sat in the hospital garden where she often reflected on how much her life had changed. Her phone buzzed with a message from Aunt Rose, another photo of Uncle Robert, this time working in their garden under strict instructions not to overdo it. She smiled at the image, then opened her calendar to confirm next week's community heart screening event. The hospital's outreach program had become a major part of her life, and she'd even started speaking at local schools about the importance of looking past prejudices and treating everyone with dignity. The little boy who had given her the drawing that day now attended the children's health education program she helped organize. His grandfather had become one of their most enthusiastic volunteers, often sharing his recovery story with new patients. A notification popped up on her phone, an article about Dr. Rivera receiving an award for his work in community medicine. The same conference he had missed to save her uncle had invited him back as their keynote speaker for next year. Mrs. Chen felt a familiar mix of shame and gratitude, but now it motivated her to work harder at being better. As she headed back inside, she passed the wall of thank you cards, now including one from Uncle Robert. But more importantly, there were cards from families she had helped during their own difficult times. Each one reminded her that change was possible, that a single moment of awakening could lead to a lifetime of growth. At the end of her shift, Mrs. Chen gathered her things, exchanging warm goodbyes with the staff she now considered family. Walking to her car, she remembered that horrible morning on the plane, how she had let prejudice cloud her judgment. Now, every time she helped a frightened family or held someone's hand during their darkest hour, she felt another small piece of her old self fall away, replaced by something far better: compassion, understanding, and a deep commitment to treating every person with the dignity they deserved.